Free and John Paul Jones heard that I was getting a band together and phoned me. Rose and said, "I hear you on the band thing. How about me on the bass?" And I said, "Cool. Okay." I would play because I played with him in the studio and various sittings. Well, that's a tough question. Someone once asked me who the people were things I'd liked the most through all those years in music. And I remember thinking, well, how on earth do you answer something to that effect? It's a lot more easily when people ask about the guitar players. They'll ask me about Jeff or Eric or Hendrix, and we can sit there talking about guitars all afternoon. So simple. But when you begin talking about people you really knew, people you spent years of your life with, that's something completely different. And funny thing is, I don't remember most. You know, the way everyone else does. People mention Led Zeppelin and immediately they think of the records, the concerts, all those enormous crowds. I don't always think of that. I remember sitting around studios, waiting for somebody to get something right. I remember terrible cups of tea. I remember carrying guitars into little rooms when none of us had any idea what was going to happen next. God, there was a lot of waiting around. People don't tell you that about being in a band. You spend an awful lot of your life waiting. And that's when you really get to know somebody. On the road, backstage, in hotel rooms. Sitting around after a show when everybody's too tired to go anywhere. You learn who makes you laugh. You learn who you can trust. You learn who you want sitting beside you when things aren't going particularly well. Of course we had Rose. Everybody did. There were people on this list I didn't always agree with. There were times we probably didn't want to see each other at all. But that doesn't erase 50 or 60 years. That's the funny thing about getting older. You forget some of the arguments. You forget what they were even about. But you remember somebody's laugh. You remember the sound of them walking into a room. So, yes, I gave the question some thought. And there were 6 people I kept coming back to. Not because they were the most famous. I knew plenty of famous people. These were simply the ones I was very lucky to know. Well, Roy's an interesting one. I've known Roy for such a long time that it's actually quite difficult to remember when he wasn't around. People tend to connect him with Zeppelin because of the song we did for him, but that wasn't really the point of it. Roy was a friend. That's what mattered. And he was very much his own man. I always liked that about him. Roy wasn't terribly interested in fitting into anybody else's idea of what a musician ought to be. He'd say exactly what he thought, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Sometimes you agreed with him. Sometimes you thought, God, Roy, give it a rest. But you always knew where you stood. We used to spend a lot of time together. Not necessarily doing anything important either. That's the bit I remember now. Sitting around, talking about music, playing things for one another, getting into conversations that probably went on much longer than they should have. Roy could talk. Believe me, Roy could talk. And that because life with Zeppelin could become very intense. Everything around Us was moving so quickly. Another record, another tour, another country, another hotel. With Roy, I could get away from some of that. I wasn't required to be Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin every minute of the day. I could just sit there with a guitar and play. We worked together as well, of course. I played on some of his records, and years later we made music together. Again. But I never really separated the music from the friendship. That's how it was with Roy. You'd go around to see him, and sooner or later somebody would pick up a guitar. Nobody had to announce that we were going to make music now. It just happened. Funny enough, those are some of the memories I value most these days. Not the big occasions. Just two people in a room, couple of guitars nearby, talking absolute nonsense 1 minute, and playing something beautiful the next. Roy gave me that. And I've always been very fond of him. Peter was impossible to miss. I mean that literally. He was a very big man, and when Peter walked into a room, people generally noticed. But the funny thing is, when I think about him now, that's not really what I remember. I remember knowing he was there. There's a difference. In those days, particularly when Zeppelin started getting bigger, there were always people around. Promoters, record people, agents, people who suddenly wanted to be your friend because the band was doing well. Peter could smell nonsense from a mile away. And believe me, there was plenty of it. I'd known him before Zeppelin. He'd been involved with the Yardbirds, so when I started putting the new band together, there was already trust between us. That mattered to me. Peter understood what I wanted to do. He didn't sit there telling me what songs to write or how the band ought to sound. He wasn't interested in becoming the fifth member. He just said, more or less, you make the music and I'll take care of everything else. And he did. There were nights when something would be going wrong backstage, and I'd see Peter walking down the corridor. I'd think, well, that's sorted then. That was Peter. He could frighten people, certainly. I've seen grown men become very polite when he appeared. But with us, there was another side to him. He cared about the band. Really cared. Not just about how many tickets we'd sold that night. That's quite rare. When you're young, you don't always appreciate somebody protecting you. You just assume they'll always be there doing it. Then you get older and you realize how much easier they made your life. Peter took an enormous amount off our shoulders. We were allowed to concentrate on being a band. I don't think Zeppelin would have developed the way it did without that. But more than that, I missed the man. When he was gone, I missed knowing that if something went wrong somewhere nearby, there'd be this enormous fellow saying, right, leave it with me. And usually you did. Jonesy was always the quiet one. Well, quiet compared with the rest of us, anyway. John and I actually had something in common before Zeppelin ever existed. We'd both done session work in London, so we knew what those studios were like. You turn up, somebody would put a piece of music in front of you, and you better know what to do with it. There wasn't much time for drama. John was very good at that. Actually, was good at almost everything. which could be slightly annoying. He'd pick up the bass, sit at the piano, start arranging something, and somehow it would all make sense. I never had to explain very much to him. That's what I liked. When Zeppelin started, I had a very clear idea of what I wanted the band to be, but you can't really explain something like that on a piece of paper. You need people who hear it. Jonesy heard it. There were times in the studio when I'd be working something out, and John would come in with a bass part or something on keyboards, and I'd think, yes, that's it. No great conversation. No speech. Just play it again. People sometimes imagine bands sitting around discussing every little detail. We didn't always work like that. Quite often, somebody played something, and everybody knew. John was particularly good at knowing. And away from the music, he was probably the sensible one. I say probably because I'm not sure any of us were particularly sensible in those days. But if things were getting a little mad, Jonesy could stand there looking at the rest of us as though he'd somehow ended up traveling with the wrong people. I can still picture that look. We spent so many years together that you get used to somebody simply being there. On stage, in the studio, on planes, backstage. You don't stop and think about it at the time. Why would you? You're young. You think there's always another record and another tour coming. It's only much later that you realize how rare it was to find somebody you could trust that much musically. With John, I never worried. If he was there, I knew his part of the music was going to be right. Robert and I were very young when all of this started. That's something I have to remind myself of sometimes. People look back at Zeppelin now and everything seems enormous. The photographs, the records, the concerts. But when Robert first came down and we started working together, none of that existed. He was just this fellow from the Midlands with an extraordinary voice. And a lot of hair. I remember hearing him sing and thinking, well, there's certainly something going on here. We didn't know each other terribly well at first. That came later. You don't suddenly become close because somebody joins your band. You learn about somebody by spending time with them. And God, Robert and I spent some time together. We traveled everywhere. We wrote together. We sat in rooms with guitar Guinness trying things that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. There were occasions when I'd have an idea and Robert would understand immediately where it could go. That's a wonderful thing to find. We didn't always agree, of course. Robert could be stubborn. So could I. I'm sure he'd tell you I was worse. There were moments over the years when we wanted very different things. Particularly after Zeppelin. That's hardly a secret. But when you've shared that much of your life with somebody, an argument doesn't suddenly wipe everything away. I think people sometimes forget that. They see two musicians who aren't working together and assume there must be some terrible hatred between them. Life isn't quite that simple. Robert and I went through things together that very few other people could really understand. The excitement when the band was beginning, the madness when it became enormous, and then some very difficult years as well. you don't forget the person who was standing beside you through all of that. When we worked together again years later, there were moments when I'd look across, and it felt strangely familiar. Older faces, obviously. Probably slightly better behaved. But I'd play something, Robert would come in, and there it was again. That little connection. You can't manufacture that. We'd had it when we were young men, and somewhere underneath everything that happened afterward, it never completely disappeared. Bonzo was different. There's no clever way of putting it. I loved the man. People always want to talk to me about his drumming, and of course I understand that. You couldn't stand in front of John Bonham playing drums and not feel it. Sometimes I think you felt him before you actually heard him. But I knew the fellow sitting behind the drums. That's who I miss. John could be incredibly funny. He could be loud. He could be difficult. He could walk into a room, and somehow the whole atmosphere would change within 5 minutes. You always knew when Bonzo was around. And when we played, there was this trust between us that I don't think we ever really discussed. We didn't need to. I'd be playing something on stage, and I'd hear John behind me. Sometimes he'd do something completely unexpected, and I'd turn around and look at him. He'd have that look on his face, almost like, go on, then. So, I'd go somewhere else with the guitar, and he'd come with me. Those were wonderful moments. People hear the finished records now. They know where every drum fill is coming. We didn't have that luxury when we were making the music. We were finding it together. John made that exciting. And the funny thing about him was that, for all the power people associate with him, he could be incredibly sensitive as a musician. He listened. That's what great musicians do. He listened to everybody. When John died, well, that was very difficult. I don't think any of us really knew what to do with it. People asked almost immediately what was going to happen to the band. I couldn't think like that. My friend had gone. Somebody I'd spent all those years traveling with and playing with simply wasn't going to walk through the door again. For a while, I didn't particularly want to hear music. I certainly didn't feel like picking up a guitar. That's how badly it hit me. Even now, when I hear certain Zeppelin recordings, I don't sit there thinking about how technically brilliant the drums are. I hear John. I can see him sitting there. And for a few minutes, Bonzo's back in the room. Jeff goes back further with me than almost anybody. Long before Zeppelin, long before the Yardbirds, really, before anybody cared who we were. We were just kids who liked guitars. I must have been about 11 or 12 when we first met. His sister knew my sister. And Jeff came around to the house one day. He had a guitar with him, of course. That's really how it started. And you have to remember finding another kid who was serious about the guitar in those days wasn't quite as easy as it became later. So, when you found somebody who knew the same records, who wanted to figure out the same things, you held on to that. Jeff and I would sit around playing. One of us would learn something and show the other one. Then he'd come back with something else. There was always a little bit of competition there, I suppose, but it was good competition. Jeff could do something and I'd think, bloody hell. How did he do that? He probably thought the same about me. Occasionally. At least I hope he did. Years later, we ended up together in the Yardbirds, and by then, I already knew exactly how good he was. Jeff didn't play like anybody else. That was the thing. You could give 10 guitarists the same instrument and Jeff would somehow make his sound completely different. He was always searching for something, a strange noise, a different touch. Something nobody had quite done before. But when I think of Jeff now, I don't immediately think about any of that. I think about the boy who came round to the house with a guitar. That's funny, isn't it? You live this whole enormous life. Records, tours, bands, all of it. And eventually, your mind goes all the way back to the beginning. When Jeff died, I found myself thinking about those early days quite a lot. We'd known each other for more than 60 years. That's most of a lifetime. And if I could have one afternoon with him again, I don't think I'd want a stage or a studio. I'd probably just want 2 chairs, a couple of guitars, and Jeff sitting there saying, "Have you heard this?" Well, when you put all those names together, I suppose you start to see what I was really talking about. It wasn't about who played the best. I've known far too many extraordinary musicians to start that argument. It was about who was there. Roy was there when I could get away from all the madness for a while. Peter was there when the madness needed somebody to control it. Jonesy was there whenever the music needed someone who simply understood what was required. Robert. Well, Robert and I went through almost everything together. And Bonzo was Bonzo. I still miss him. Then there's Jeff, who somehow takes me all the way back to being a boy again. Sitting there with a guitar and discovering things for the first time. That's what stays with you. It's funny. When you're young, you think you'll remember the concerts forever. You think you'll remember exactly what happened in New York or Los Angeles or wherever you happen to be that night. Some of it disappears. I couldn't tell you what happened after half those shows now. But I can remember somebody laughing in the next room. I can remember Bonzo sitting behind the kit. I can remember Peter's voice coming down the corridor. I can remember Jeff with a guitar. Those things don't seem important when they're happening. Later on, they become everything. Of course there are people I wish I'd had more time with. There are conversations I'd quite like to have again. There are probably a few things I'd say differently, too. That's life, isn't it? You don't know which afternoon is going to be the last one. You don't know when you're walking out of a room that somebody won't be sitting there the next time you come back. So, yes, I'm proud of the music. I'm very proud of what we made. But, after all these years, when I think about how lucky I've been, I don't think first about the records hanging on walls. I think about the people who were in the room when we made them.